everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Shona Oladere from Statecraft Inc. and I'm excited to welcome you to another edition of Statecraft Inc. Behind the State Roundtable Series. We're going to be having a very insightful discussion with Dr. Chinonso Edema, also known as Apricot Doctor, and also Dr. Ola Orekurin Brown. Hello, Dr. Ola. Hi, Dr. Bobby.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, nice to have you with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Can you hear me? Are you there?
Yes, we can.
Yes, and yeah. So today we're going to be discussing innovative solutions to scale prevention of epidemics and access to treatment. It's particularly important for us to have this discussion today. Today is actually April 25th, and it's World Malaria Day. And in as much as right now the world is raving with the coronavirus, we must remind ourselves of the fact that we still have malaria and other epidemics to deal with. To join us in this discussion, we'll also be having Mr. Olaolu Osayin. He will be joining us later on in this discussion. So I'll just go very quickly into the introduction. So I'm sure we already know Dr. Ola Orekurin Brown is the CEO of Flying Doctors. They're doing an amazing work. They've been doing an amazing work over the years, and even now with dealing with this pandemic. We also have Dr. Bobby Egwema. He is a health blogger and is also the founder of Health Trend. So he's also known as Apricot Doctor on Twitter. Thank you very much for joining us today. Okay, I think Mr. Olaolu Osayin is here with us now. Hi, Mr. Olaolu.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining. How are you today?
Fine, thank you.
Mr. Olaolu is the CEO of the Center for Medical Law Research and Development, CMLRD, and is also the Vice President of the World Association for Medical Law, which is a global body of scholars in the medical health and law. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today on innovative solutions to kill prevention and epidemics and access to treatment. I believe it's going to be a great learning experience hearing from all of you. Very quickly, I just want to jump into the question. So, Dr. Bobby, we know about the pandemic, the coronavirus. We've been hearing all sorts. It's been from one case to the other. On NCDC's Twitter page, we see the pinned tweets about the coronavirus. The numbers keep raging, and it's almost like we don't have any other disease in the world apart from coronavirus. So I want to ask, being in the health sector, how do we bring people's consciousness to the fact that other diseases and other epidemics exist, even though we're battling, with the coronavirus? Dr. Bobby?
Yes, so it's expected when we have infectious pandemic like this, that's all the attention would be directed towards that pandemic. Even in it's happening everywhere. But in the case of Nigeria, where we have other infectious diseases that may still be on the ground and affecting people, there's also need for attention to also be on these infectious diseases. For example, today is the World Malaria Day, and for some reason it doesn't feel like the World Malaria Day because everybody's still worried about the coronavirus pandemic. It's just like every other thing in developing countries. I think that the awareness should start from the grassroots. If the people in general do not have any idea of what's healthy, they would not be able to do the right thing. So starting from the grassroots is one of the most important things in ensuring that yes, we have the coronavirus pandemic, but at the same time, we don't lose sight of other infectious diseases that may be lurking in the background. We still have infections like Lassa and Ebola some states in Nigeria are still battling till date. So the awareness, or the public awareness, must start from the grassroots. we have a lot of radio and media and digital media being used for public health awareness. But I feel that in a nation like Nigeria, most of what we do should be focused on the grassroots. And if we're being honest, Nigeria is still a very religious nation. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. And we found that people tend to listen more to the religious leaders than they do health bodies, than they do even the government itself. So trying to bring in the religious leaders of these different communities and even community health, or not community health, but community leaders, and trying to get them to understand the impact of these diseases and letting them share it with the people that they lead. So identify key leaders in these communities and let them understand that they also need to protect against these infectious diseases. Yes, even while we're fighting against the coronavirus.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Bobby. That's really insightful. I'd like to get to Dr. Ola Brown. What's your opinion about this? How do you bring people's consciousness about the other diseases that, that we have, even though we're still trying to deal with coronavirus? Or do you think we should just, stop discussing about all the diseases? Or how do you think we can, bring in people's consciousness about the other diseases? Dr. Ola?
So I actually think it's pretty interrelated in terms of I think that coronavirus is directly related to all the other diseases, and I'll explain why. As long as we have coronavirus, the sort of biggest risk that coronavirus gives us or presents to us is, overwhelming our healthcare systems. Looking after patients with coronavirus, as we can see from the US, from Italy, from Spain, it overwhelms healthcare systems and it takes all the resources away from everything else and sort of absorbs it into one particular disease. The reason why everybody is so worried about coronavirus is because it's number one, very, very highly contagious. And number two, it has the potential to kill a lot of people. So the estimated death toll from coronavirus in America is 200,000 people. If a disease can kill 200,000 people in a whole America, then you can imagine sort of the death toll that it could take in Nigeria if it's not controlled. And just to explain why I said a whole America, it's because America spends $10,000 for every single citizen on healthcare per year. Nigeria spends $6 federal budget for every single citizen per year. So even a country that spends $10,000 on every citizen per year is still struggling with this disease. In terms of intensive care units, because we know that severe coronavirus patients end up in intensive care, for every member of the population, for every 100,000 people in the population, America has 35 ventilators. So that means America, out of every 100,000 people, America has the capacity already installed to care for 35 ventilated patients. Nigeria has 0.07 ICU beds for every 100,000 people. If you look at the doctor-patient ratios, America has about, I can't remember the exact number, but about 40 doctors for every 100,000 people. Nigeria has about maybe 6, maybe 4. So we're dealing with very, very, very different healthcare systems, very, very different levels of resources, very, very different levels of healthcare infrastructure. And I think that if we let coronavirus get out of control, then it will overwhelm everything else in Nigeria. It will overwhelm our healthcare infrastructure, and we won't have the time to think about anything else. Because I imagine if America is predicting that 200,000 people would die, then you have to times it by 10 for Nigeria to get a serious number with the lack of healthcare infrastructure we have. So I think it's imperative, in order to be able to have the mental space to concentrate on anything else, we need to get a handle on this thing, because this thing has the potential of wiping out 1 to 10% of our population if we're not careful. So I think it's super, super important to focus on this And I think that the one way that we can keep it out of the main hospitals is setting up isolation centers within the hospital grounds, but away from the normal patients. So normal patients can still receive routine care, while patients who are coronavirus positive are in separate facilities where they're all coronavirus positive, and where they can receive specialized treatment.
Oh, great. Great. Thanks a lot for sharing that. Thanks a lot. Mr. Oleolu, when we talk about innovative solutions, what comes to mind most times is technology and then digital, comes to mind. But we understand that policy has a huge role to play in terms of, developing innovative solutions. So I want to know, like, in your role in CLMRD, what roles or what are the loopholes that affect the implementation of policy? Because oftentimes it's not like we don't have those policies. Those policies are there, but sometimes implementation is quite, there's like a gap in implementation. So what is your perspective? What do you have to say about fixing the loopholes in implementing policies in Nigeria? Thank you.
Yes, thanks for that question. There's a difference between development in technology, medicine, and government policies in that regard, and legislation. So we have a challenge here whereby we have advancement in technology in various aspects of medical practice. A lot of them actually need well thought out legislations and protocols. And there, for example, we do lack that in certain respects. So, for example, pandemic situation now, one would expect that e-health should be with the focus that is, we're talking about telemedicine and telementoring. But with regards to that as well, we begin to look as well that what structures do we have in place for adequate telementoring in Nigeria or telemedicine in Nigeria? I'm aware that Lagos State government has set up a telemedicine platform. One of the few persons that consulted with them in that regard. But it has to be a national broad-based situation. And so we find at times that we find a bit of, particularly now that hospitals are not taking in patients. Those of us in the medical legal sector now are getting a lot of patients who are calling us out of anger that doctors are refusing to treat them by virtue of suspicion of them being COVID-19 patients. As a matter of fact, some even say that doctors totally refuse, to attend to them when they come to the hospitals. This is a viable and ripe opportunity for telemedicine, for example, whereby, we could use technology to do some basic innate consultations. However, I've been at the same time, I'm privileged to design some protocol for some hospitals I work for. However, the challenge we have is that by the time push gets to shove, you just might find out that the protocols you've set in place is totally alien to the existing laws. So, and legislation. So the first thing you ask yourself when you have a problem now, when a hospital setup has introduced technology innovations like telemedicine, then there's a crisis that appears along the way, you begin to ask certain questions. Usually the basic expectation from regulators is that the doctor must physically touch his patients. Now, when we had that as the baseline protocol, then we didn't envisage that we'll have pandemics that will ravage us this much. So we now have instances where it might sound unreasonable for you to commence treatment on patients where, like what we are doing now, Zoom, Skype, WhatsApp, or whatever, but the reality on ground is that it's getting to a point whereby these are becoming, the realities that we have to deal with. So now what needs to happen now is that we now need to have legislations that essentially allows the doctors to legally do what they're doing right now, that is, deploying innovation. And along the way as well, we also have problems that will come with that. What is the guarantee that my communication with my doctor will be confidential? What is the guarantee that my data will be confidential? What is the guarantee that me showing you my doctor some innate parts of my body will not be leaked online? So along with technology comes the challenges with it as well. issues of hacking, issues of tech, even issues of infrastructure, where at times you have internet that doesn't effectively work, internet that is buffering, you know. Then again, we have issues of telementoring. Now, telementoring is a situation whereby my consultant is supervising me, the surgeon, but he is not physically there with us in the theater. So the consultant could be in Dubai, the consultant could be in California, and he's instructing me to go 6 centimeters down. Now, the question that arises now is that as at the time the consultant who is in America or in Spain instructing me practicing medicine in Nigeria on what to do, is that person licensed to practice medicine in Nigeria? But in fact, he's actually practicing medicine here through technology. But the question the lawyers will ask you when the problem arises is that the person that was mentoring you is such a person licensed to practice in that jurisdiction. So those are the things that will arise along the way. And then again, we also find out at times, well, most of the times, that when we begin to use technology, information that shouldn't get to certain person's hands will get there. So your IT consultant in your office did not swear to the Hippocratic Code that the doctor swore to, the oath of secrecy. So what binds him from getting home and divulging my information? The doctor might not be inclined to give out patient information, but the IT guy who has access to everything, you know, might want to trend, might want to, you know. And then again, we find out as well that the way technology is done and algorithms and all that, we find out there are certain instances where automatically your confidentiality is breached. Your right to privacy is breached. And I give a simple example. You deploy e-health, telemedicine in certain instances, and I need drugs, for example, on erectile dysfunction. You just might be surprised that the next day I start getting emails of people advertising drugs on erectile dysfunction. Automatically, I'll have a feeling that, you know, just like when you buy things on Facebook, you buy a research on Facebook today, or at least you price it on Facebook today, then the following day you keep seeing different various types of wristwatches, you know. So we begin to think that, oh, who is breaching my confidentiality here? And then people live on data. And the misconception is that data is life. They think data is a new currency, but not medical data. And that's the misconception they have. So the guy who is trying to do exponential marketing can use your data through your bank, can use your data through your internet provider, but you cannot sell such data or make such data available to such persons when they are medical data. There's a misconception. A lot of people who are excited about technology-based medical practice think that the data will be useful for them. It shouldn't be useful for them because they're not supposed to benefit from it, because they're not supposed to let out patient information, except when required by law, or except with the patient's consent or instances of public health. You know, so if there is a growing need in a particular state of need for cancer treatment or need for infertility, you cannot use it as, you know, you cannot use it to, you know, you can't sell such information to the farmers, to pharmaceutical companies, you know, for that benefit, because those information are what? Confidential. So we find ourselves in a mixed bag, and you really have to be careful. You know, in as much as you're excited about technology, it's not all technology, particularly when it's medical based, you understand, that can be used. Your bankers can go and, you know, divulge your technology, your data to internet subscribers and other people doing exponential marketing. But I'll be, for the life of me, I will sue my doctor if my doctor divulges my medical information for exponential marketing, for example. I hope it's clear.
Thank you so much for that. Dr. Olabra, I'd like you to weigh in on this. You know, how do we reconcile technology advancement and data privacy and, you know, patient confidentiality? I know that you've worked within this space. So how do we reconcile, you know, advancement in technology and also ensuring data privacy, Dr. Olabra?
Even beyond data privacy, which affect the implementation of telemedicine in Nigeria, From the last numbers that I looked at, there are only about 26 million, maybe 30 million at the most, smartphones in Nigeria. So not a lot of people have access to the internet. So what I don't believe in is technology for technology's sake. Sometimes in Nigeria, we introduce stuff because it's globally it's cool. So for example, I think a good example of that was e-commerce. It was a trend globally and everybody was funding e-commerce. So then all Nigerians ran and started funding e-commerce companies, but none of those companies did well. None of those companies turned a profit because we weren't thinking about sort of more localized solutions that, could help the average Nigerian and things that Nigerians wanted. So when you look at the numbers really in terms of data penetration, data cost, there's still some infrastructural issues that have to be addressed before you can have any sort of impact in the telemedicine space. And also, I think that, if you look at people in terms of affordability of data and the number of people on the internet, you can see that, we have a two-tier system in Nigeria in terms of access to the internet. There's the people that can afford it and the people that can't afford it. There are a lot of people in, the second tier Nigerians. So in customer sort of segmentation, there's Nigeria 1, what I'll call Nigeria 1, that earns $9,000 and above, and then there's Nigeria 2 that are between sort of $3,000 to $9,000 and above. And even in Nigeria 2, you see a lot of people without data access. So I think, there's huge infrastructural issues with the adoption of telemedicine in Nigeria. And I think one of the biggest issues is price. So in India, telemedicine hasn't been widely adopted either. But in India, I think it's more practical because the cost of internet in India is 26 cents per gigabyte. In Nigeria, it's almost 3 cents per gigabyte. The number of smartphone users in India is 300 million. And actually, I've got the right statistic now. The number of smartphone users in Nigeria is just 25 million. And it's not 25 million individuals because I have 2 smartphones. My husband has a few smartphones. Rich people have Airtel smartphone, MTN smartphone. So the number of unique users is actually lower than 25 million. And in a country of 200 million, you need really good access to the internet, good access to data, cheap data, and then last mile connectivity to the rural areas. Those are the people that are most cut off from the healthcare system. So I think that, yes, technology is useful, it's valid, it's important, and telemedicine is very, very important for the development of healthcare in Nigeria. But I think we have to sort of localize it and look at, solutions that can affect the most vulnerable Nigerians, because the rich people in Nigeria actually do have healthcare problems, but we can solve them. We're in Lagos, we're in Abuja, we have money, we can pay, we can go to hospitals. But what about the 80 million people living in extreme poverty in Nigeria, the highest number of people in the entire world living in extreme poverty who don't have smartphones? How do we sort of leverage on technology and leverage on telemedicine to help them? So the issue of confidentiality is there, but I think first of all, we need to get past the barrier of cost, the barrier of access, and the barrier of sort of user experience in terms of what these people would rather do, how their health-seeking behavior is, before we can even get onto the issue of their confidentiality.
Okay, thanks a lot for that, Dr. Ola Brown. Dr. Bobby, I'd like you to weigh in on this. How do we deal with this infrastructure challenges? So, for example, access to electricity, internet, how can what are the measures we can take in order to deal with this infrastructure challenges?
Well, the measures are quite simple. I think Dr. Ola has explained or rather shared the thoughts on almost everything. There are a lot of hindrances when it comes to accepting telemedicine, especially here in Nigeria. One of the things is internet access. For instance, I have been on certain Zoom conferences where I haven't been able to connect, not because I don't have electricity, not because I don't have a smartphone, but simply because I do not have access to very good internet. You find Nigerians having to, switch from internet provider to internet provider. Dr. Ola mentioned something about people having one or two, three smartphones even. One of the reasons this happens is simply because you cannot trust one network provider at a time. So the quality of the internet that we have here in Nigeria, aside issues like price, one of the things that will greatly affect uh, the acceptance of telemedicine, especially here in Nigeria, is the quality of the internet. Even mentoring services, telementoring that Mr. Olaolu shared might not be very easy to perform in Nigeria, simply because it's not reliable in certain cases like um, surgery, for instance. So if the mentoring surgeon says six centimeters upward, and then it takes about 2 or 3 seconds for the performing doctor to hear that, you might run into problems. And when it comes to surgery, um, every second counts, every inch counts, every moment is important. So internet connectivity, which we are still struggling with, is one of the things that will greatly hinder the things that would increase the uptake of telemedicine in Nigeria. So we need to increase internet and increase the internet connectivity, and that also boils down even into electricity and infrastructure and the rest of all these things.
Oh, great. Thanks a lot, Dr. Bobby, for that. Uh, just move on to Mr. Olaolu. You mentioned while we were discussing about patient confidentiality, and now with the coronavirus, more like once you get infected, the you have to tell the NCDC and all of that. So does it mean that we can't practice patient confidentiality at all when dealing with pandemics, or how can we still have patient confidentiality when dealing with pandemic, Mr. Olaolu?
Well, patient confidentiality is part of the fundamental rights of a patient, which is right to privacy. However, you find out that even though there are certain laws, rights that are guaranteed by the Constitution, we also have what we call derogation clauses, whereby such rights can be suspended. Public health is one of such instances where your right to privacy can easily be suspended. So, for example, you have Lassa fever or Ebola, or even cholera, talk less of COVID-19. There are certain instances whereby the law requires your practitioner by law, mandates your practitioner by law to inform regulators of regulators or other stakeholders of your prevailing health circumstances, particularly if it relates essentially to public health, because the fundamental thinking of the law is that where your right to privacy starts and ends is where your neighbor's right to life begins. So you have instances where even though you vehemently oppose or refuse the patient, your health worker, they forge your information, the health worker, on the other hand, is bound and compelled by law to so disclose. In such instances of pandemics, we find out that we're not only talking about rights of confidentiality, essentially, we're also talking about instances where your personal liberty itself can be derogated upon. So that is where, for example, we have instances of persons who are in isolation centers wanting to escape. And then the governors can say that if you sneak out of the isolation centers, you will be shot. Because, for example, they do know that they have a right in that instance to restrain you. we had such conflicts with unfortunate incidents of Ebola with first consultant hospital and Dr. Adadevo, who, who had a diplomat, so to speak, and that person was started to our rights of privacy, of freedom of movement and all that. And they said, no, these are pandemic instances. You cannot, your right in such instances will be derogated upon. So you cannot enforce your right to privacy. So if one goes with Ebola or coronavirus or COVID-19 now and says, no, don't tell my family members, don't tell the government. If you tell the government, I will sue you. I mean, it has died a natural death, because where your right to privacy starts and ends is where the right to life of others, begins, So that's why we find instances whereby you can legally restrain. So even if you find somebody who is uncooperative, the law allows the healthcare providers to lock such persons up by restraining him physically. You can handcuff him to a bed, you can lock him up in a room, you can, put booby traps around his room, whatever you can do to restrain. So in instances of pandemics, you do not enforce rights. We are in a situation of war, so to speak. So in such instances, your rights are derogated upon. So don't be surprised. The only thing at times which might blur might be your identity to third parties who are not part of the caregiving society. So if I come to your hospital, you can divulge certain instances, but you might restrain yourself from divulging that it is me, as divulging my personal information to persons who are not treating me or persons who are not relevant to my treatment. You understand? That's how far you can go. So you collect people who are hounding the government or not disclosing the identity of the Italian who was the index case of COVID-19 here. Yes, they said, okay, yes, we can disclose certain information, but we'll not go as far as disclosing his identity because he has not waived that right, But in the instance that he was a bit uncooperative, they could have restrained and in such instance probably disclosed his identity. So there is nothing like rights in situations of emergencies like this. Even in core medical practice, general medical practice, there are certain instances where issues of consent and other issues of rights are derogated upon, particularly when we see ourselves in a situation of emergency, and as defined by law means when there is reasonable expectation for loss of life or limb. Yeah, so people cannot hold on tenaciously to the fact that they have certain inalienable rights of confidentiality, particularly during this pandemic situation we find ourselves in. I hope I'm able to answer your question.
Thanks a lot. Like one of the things that what you just shared is how difficult it is to ensure like the patient confidentiality, even though like legally people should have access to that, but during times of pandemics like this, it's a bit difficult. Thank you so much for that. Dr. Ola, I'd like to in on the lockdown. There's been clamor and people advocating that the lockdown should be removed, even Professor Soludo, and then we have some other Western countries removing the lockdown, and even in Ghana as well, the lockdown as well is lifted. So what is your advice for Nigeria? In the case of Nigeria, you gave us the ratio, you broke out everything. What do you think we should do? Do you think it's advisable to leave the lockdown? What's your advice?
So I was hoping you would ask me this question because it's so difficult. And it puts me in a difficult situation because, as you know, I'm a medical doctor and I'm also completing my degree in economics. So I have like a very good medical perspective and a very good economic perspective. And obviously the economist in me says, the economy is more important and we need to get markets working. We need to get people back to work. Our fiscal policy situation is in tatters. There's going to be a mass default from the banks, the devaluation issues. But obviously the doctor in me doesn't want people to die. And if we open up the economy, then more people are going to die than if we were locked down. If we can, so I believe that we actually do know how to deal with poverty, right? We give people food. And I think that this needs to be done efficiently. And if we can distribute food efficiently, then people won't die of hunger. And Nigerians, we distribute food all the time. We've been distributing food for a long time. We're a very communal society. So, you know, when I was growing up in England, there were people that never spoke to their neighbors in England. There are people that, you know, hadn't spoken to their parents in the past 30 years. But in Nigeria, we do live in a close-knit community, and we send money to our parents. We send money to our relatives. We're a very, very close community. So I think even though we do have the highest poverty burden in the world, 90 million people almost living in extreme poverty, I think that the toll in terms of death would definitely be higher on the grassroots if we did a complete opening of the economy. So I think there may be a middle ground where we can do a staged reopening of the economy with precautions, but that middle ground has to be really carefully thought about. And I'll tell you why. Because Nigeria has an extraordinarily high number of poor people, and those poor people live very close together in sort of, you know, the face me, I face you houses, sometimes 5, 6 in a room. And we're dealing with one of the most contagious viruses that we've seen in recent times. So in Italy, they actually do live quite spaced apart. I know they like to hug each other and they like to kiss each other, but you know, Italians live far apart. Americans live in their own apartments. They don't live like us. They don't live so close together. So if we were to open up the economy and let people move around and, you know, spread the virus everywhere, then we would be in a situation where we could not handle. And it would be a situation where we'd be looking at the same thing that is happening in Ecuador, where there's dead bodies on the streets that couldn't even make it to hospital, and where we're looking at losing a significant amount of our population. Like I said, a lot of people that are diagnosed, well, a significant proportion of people that are diagnosed with coronavirus end up in intensive care. The difference between Nigeria and England and America in terms of, you know, our intensive care infrastructure is night and day. No matter how many ventilators we buy, we're not going to have the intensive care infrastructure in terms of people to be able to scale up to deal with this problem. And I'm sure, I mean, there's another doctor on the call that can testify to this. I was with some policymakers, and they said, you know, can't you learn how to be an intensive care physician in a few days? And I said, well, if it was possible in a few days, why would people be taking 5 years to do it? Like, if it was that possible, just to, you know, like a lot of people think that using a ventilator and providing intensive care is like using a toothbrush. For a toothbrush, you just have to look at it. Okay, this is the thing that is supposed to brush my teeth, put some toothbrush on there, and away you go, you can use it. It's not like that. Intensive care, especially the care of ARDS patients, acute respiratory distress syndrome patients, is very difficult even for anesthetists that has spent seven years studying patients whose circulations are not working and who are not breathing. So it would put extraordinary pressure on our healthcare system. And you'd see already in Nigeria, we have the highest number of women who die during pregnancy and childbirth. That is our baseline level without corona. That means without corona, already we have more women in the world dying in the process of pregnancy and childbirth than anywhere else in the world. We have more children under the age of 5 dying than Iraq, than Afghanistan, than Syria. So can you imagine adding the extreme burden of intensive care patients with a highly infectious disease on top of that very, very weak healthcare infrastructure? It would be a complete disaster. So somehow we need to sit down with the policymakers as doctors and as economists and as politicians and come to a middle ground between the preservation of lives and saving lives and also saving livelihoods.
Great. Okay. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Bobby, I would like to hear your opinion about this. Do you think you should give the lockdown? Do you think you should be there for a while? What's your perspective?
Well, speaking from the doctor point of view, I would say that we're not there yet. One of the reasons is there was a poll by NOI polls taken a few weeks ago that states that 28% to 29% of Nigerians still believe that the coronavirus is a hoax. Many of them still believe that the coronavirus is, a symptom of the whole 5G. What do you call it? The 5G, whatever it is. Yes. So when you release that amount of people who still do not believe that the coronavirus is real into the society and allow them mix with others, and it would lead to the kind of situation we have in Ecuador. One of the reasons that public awareness is done is simply to change behavioral patterns, and uh, people are now beginning to understand the importance of washing their hands, and hopefully the impact of the public awareness campaigns that have been going on up to this very moment can help prevent a lot of diseases even in the future, because a lot of diseases are transmitted by our hands. And if we can convince a lot more people to make hand washing a habit, then we would reduce a lot of infectious diseases in the future. But we are not there yet as a country. We are not there yet. There's still a lot of people. There's still a lot of information gap, especially in the tier 3 Nigeria, or in the people who are really poor and can't afford healthcare. And if we allow those people to come out into society, where have you seen have you seen pictures of Lagos in a busy day? That amount of crowd, I'm sure even if you have your face mask on, you would definitely be at risk of contracting the coronavirus. So yes, as a doctor, from the economic point of view, I think, I am not an economist, but I think that we will be able to bounce back from the effects. It may take a while, but we'll be able to bounce back. But I think it's better to have a lot more people alive than to have a lot more people dead.
Thanks a lot for that, Dr. Bobby. We're running out of time. I just want to take one more question for the three of you. 2020 was declared as the decade of action. So what is that one thing, like in just 1 minute, what is that one thing that you would recommend? What's that one thing that Nigeria can do to realize global health and well-being in 2030? Mr. Olao, do you want to go first? What's that one thing we can do to realize global health and well-being by 2030? Mr. Olao.
Well, I saw that now, and I'm very, very circumspect with regard to labeling objectives with dates. It's unfortunate, but it's been the Nigerian Achilles heel, so to speak. Everything we've labeled with dates has never really come to fruition. Education for all in 2020, education for all in 2020, health for all in 20, So by virtue of that, I won't label any dates for any objective reasoning. I mean, including free health, primary health, universal health program and all that. So doing that itself is introducing the failure or to it. But I think that what we really need to do might, without putting any dates involved, might be trying to, as much as possible, to scale up on health insurance. The fact that we have lots of patients who are out of pocket, patients in majority of the hospitals in the country is not sustainable. I'm one of the very few that sue hospitals or defend them in issues of malpractices. And I do know that one of the reasons why patients are, while negative outcomes occur, or while even people sue after negative outcomes, is because of the sheer anger and frustration that every process in the management of the disease was paid for. No palliatives, no soft landing, nothing. They buy the gloves, they buy the catheters, they buy every consumable, and then the man still dies. And then they feel that. So what, aside from me not paying the doctor's school fees, really speaking, I've paid for every other thing. You know, and that's where we don't appreciate our healthcare workers. So we need a situation whereby we're able to have, I mean, we've had the doctors speak. The doctors have just tried to raise our hopes. They've tried to say a lot of things being sugar coated, not trying to give us a sense of despair. But we do appreciate the fact that there are supermen and women who work in the most horrendous situations. They might not want to admit to us in order not for us to not to shaking our confidence. But the environment in which they work is highly, extremely, uncalled for. So we can have, some appreciable level in health insurance. And I believe and I hope that we take something home this time around by properly funding health. Now that all of us are stuck in this ship together, nobody can board out, nobody can port, nobody can leave. We now understand and appreciate the fact that probably if we had, been scaling up and investing in health, as if that one day I will need to benefit from this system. So I believe that I pray that our stakeholders learn from this next time around, and we stop hearing nonsensical excuses and nonsensical scenarios of doctors going on strike, because they don't have PPEs, or nurses going on strike because of they're owing them salaries. The least person you should owe, really speaking, is a health worker, but maybe now we learn from that, I mean, at times in Nigeria, until push gets to shove, that we will now begin to try or pretend to do the right thing. So I won't make a date, I will not, so I won't jinx it, but rather I will say that we need to scale up our health insurance, and we clearly need to fund health. Look, where are all the guns now that we bought for insurgency? What help are they to us now? Where are all the money we spent on sports? Where is all the money we spent on entertainers? Where is all the money we spent on whatever? But now we are looking at these doctors that we have ignored. So with all due respect, we should give a standing ovation to the doctors around. These are the same people that we have denigrated over time. They're now they are the ones we are looking up to. Resident doctors, consultants, nurses, midwives, they're the ones that are looking up to, like supermen and women, as if they're the X-Men. So we need to, seriously fund it and take them more serious. The next time the doctor coughs, the entire country catches pneumonia. I hope I made some sense.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Mr. Olaolu, for that. I'm glad you didn't put a date. Like for you, you don't want to do a date because Nigeria is very tricky with the dates. And that's why, like, we have the African Union for dates. So they have this African Union 2063 agenda. Like, people that would not even be alive to even see it coming to fruition. So just when we can pick a date that is close, we just choose a date that no one will be able to track or influence. But thanks a lot for like sharing this insight of how we need to work with this. And you made the vital point about the amount that we apportion for the health sector. Because really now what's good and important is the sport and the other aspects.
Yeah.
Everyone is on lockdown.
Just before I go, if all the money that we have been spending on the Super Eagles, if we have diverted half of it to the federal medical centers all over the country, we will not have this problem now. Some people will go to a tournament for 3 weeks, kicking a round leather ball, and we give them $5,000-$10,000 a day for losing or winning a match. Now we have doctors that we are trying to scale hazard allowance from 5,000 naira to whatever amount for. We must now have a rethink in what actually holds value and makes more sense to us. Some things just don't add up anymore right now. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Dr. Bobby, I want to weigh in your opinion about this. What do you think? What's that one thing that we could do to attain global health and well-being in 2030? And if you don't want to put a date to it, it's fine.
So one of the things that I believe that Nigeria should be doing urgently is data. Nigeria needs to collect data. One of the things that is also important, not just any type of data, but data, good quality data. I don't know if you heard about how Nigeria became one of the biggest economies in 2014. That was simply because they changed the way that, the gross domestic product was being calculated. This is something that should have been done every 2-3 years, but it wasn't done for decades. And it makes you realize that for years, Nigeria was, making decisions based on old or data that is outdated. So one of the things that Nigeria needs to be doing urgently, especially to achieve this development goals by whatever year they choose. But one of the things that must be done urgently is ensuring that good quality data is ensured, and the data that should also be timely, not collect data now and the next time the data will be collected, the next time data like that will be collected, maybe in another 10 years, another 15 years, another 20 years. We need to have the culture of the African leaders, especially the Nigerian leaders, ensuring that most of their decisions that are taken is based on data. It is almost as if we're being led by a group of people who just wake up and decide to make decisions when they can. I have worked in organizations where the chief executive officer would ensure that every decision she makes is based on the data that she currently has. And, data is king, and the data should be taken, especially Nigeria should imbibe a culture of taking data. For example, you cannot know how many schools to build if you do not know how many children are currently out of school. So these are the type of things that we need to imbibe as a nation in order to achieve any health development goal. And we need to do that with as much urgency as we can. So collecting good quality data is one of the things that should be done as a country.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Bobby, for training that. I totally agree with you, because there's no way you can make informed decisions without having the right data. And, this data issue you just pointed out is one of the issues. Like, that's why we have a lot of people clamoring about the palliative that the government claims to be distributing. And they're like, who are you distributing this palliative to? Because you're not even sure of the numbers of people that you should categorize as poor people, right? And then that's why at some point they were contemplating that they were going to use people that recharge below 100 naira, like the recharge within 100 naira spend, and that's how they were going to distribute palliative to people that need it. So it's very important. I think that's one thing that, I would take away from what you shared. Dr. Ola, I want to hear from you. While Mr. Ola was talking, right, it mentioned about the budget allocating certain amount to the health sector. So according to the World Health Organization, 5% of the GDP should go into health. For Nigeria and other African countries, we've not been following that recommendation. But moving forward to achieving global health and well-being, what do you think we can do? How should we? And then you're also an economist, by the way. So tell us, what do you think we should do? How can we allocate funding for our healthcare sector? Dr. Ola.
I think we need to get richer. I think if you focus on, I think there are two elements. Number one, healthcare hasn't really been a priority. And I think it needs to be prioritized more. But there's a reason for that. I honestly think that Nigeria is actually too poor to have good healthcare right now. Our fiscal situation is in a complete mess. If you are spending, we set a budget of about 20 billion naira, $20 billion as a total budget, and we spend almost 70% of it paying back a debt, remaining what? Remaining 30%. And then we use about 80% of that money to pay civil servants, remaining what? Remaining 20% of the small percentage that we had in the first place. So what money are we going to use to do healthcare? Healthcare is expensive, very, very expensive. The UK NHS, for instance, their budget for healthcare for just 60 million people in a year is $200 billion. That is enough to pay Nigeria's healthcare budget for 200 years, what they spend in 1 year. That means that it will take care of you, it will take care of your children, and it will even start taking care of what they spend in healthcare for 1 year. We'll start taking care of your children's children. Before, so we're really not serious about what we allocate to health, but we don't even have the money to build a proper healthcare system. I think we need to start changing our structures. And I think the most important thing that can improve healthcare from what I see is economic growth. I think that we can argue whether 5% of GDP or 10% of GDP, even 20% of GDP, but they do, how much is the GDP? How much can we extract from the GDP? How much are we paying back? We're chronically indebted. Our fiscal situation does not, the oil price is falling. Like Nigeria is actually an extremely poor country in terms of GDP per capita. So I think that we just need to sort out our economics. We need to get debt forgiveness if it's possible. We need to free up our budget, get more fiscal space to invest in these things, because healthcare is expensive. There's no going around that. There's no cheaper way of buying an MRI. There's no cheaper way of putting the infrastructure in place. Yeah, it's possible to do more with less, but there's a minimum amount of investment that needs to happen. And for my own minimum standard that I would like to put in Nigeria, honestly, I look at the budget and I just do not see the money. So I think we can do better by prioritizing healthcare, but at the same time, we must prioritize our economic growth. We must get Nigeria working. We must get the wheels of productivity moving. We must make it easy for people to do business. Because if we don't put those reforms in place, then we might as well forget about healthcare, because you cannot have the same healthcare as Norway that is spending $7,000 per person on healthcare with your $4. Because the people that are spending 7,000, they're not foolish people. Obviously, they're getting something for that 7,000, and you cannot use $4 to get the same thing. So economic growth is a huge, huge imperative for me in terms of just making the country richer and having more resources to spend on healthcare. But then we have to make sure that healthcare is a priority. When we decided that we wanted to produce our own cement, we invested in it. We invested in the company, we invested in the value chain, and we made sure that Nigeria produced cement. When we decided that Nigeria was going to become a banking hub for Africa, we invested in the companies, we invested in the people behind those companies, and you can see the banks today. When Nigeria decided that we're going to have mobile phones and GSM, we bought the company, we invested in those companies, we made it easy for those companies to thrive, and we can see it today. So just like we wanted cement, just like we wanted banking, just like we wanted telecommunications, Nigeria also has to prioritize healthcare. So I've cheated a little bit because I've said two things instead of one. Number one, growth above everything. Do everything you can to increase productivity. And number two, make healthcare a priority. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Ola Brown. That was so insightful. You know, productivity and making healthcare a priority. We have to round up right now, but thank you so much for taking our time to be a part of the Mandela State Roundtable. It was a very insightful discussion from Mr. Olaolu, Dr. Bobby, Dr. Ola Brown. Thank you so much for your time, and keep enjoying the lockdown. Thank you so much. And please, you can follow us and subscribe at Statecraft Inc. In case if you joined in late, we'll post the video so that you can learn from everything we discussed. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Dr. Ola, once again. Thank you, Dr. Bobby, and thank you, Mr. Olaolu. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.